The wind howled like 1,000 wolves as Harper Garrison stumbled through the snow. Her fingers so numb she could no longer feel them, her breath coming in ragged gasps that burned her lungs with each inhale of the bitter February air. Harper pounded on the door with fists that felt like blocks of ice, screaming until her throat went raw. But the wind swallowed her cries whole, and the boarding house stood silent and dark, its other residents either gone or unable to hear her desperate pleas over the storm's fury. She had been living in Montrose for only 3 months, having traveled west from Boston after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back, and she had found work as a seamstress in Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, scraping together enough money to rent a small room in the boarding house on the edge of town. Now she stood shivering in her thin wool dress and shawl, her boots already soaked through, her fingers turning blue, and she knew with terrible certainty that if she did not find shelter soon, she would freeze to death on this doorstep. The cold ate through her bones as she turned away from the locked door, wrapping her arms around herself and squinting through the wall of white that surrounded her. She could barely make out the shapes of other buildings through the snow, everything blurred and distorted by the blizzard's rage, but she knew she had to move or die. Her feet felt heavy as lead as she forced herself forward, each step a battle against the wind that tried to knock her down, and she had no idea where she was going, only that she could not stop moving or the cold would claim her. She stumbled and fell to her knees in a snowdrift, the impact jarring her whole body, and for a moment she considered simply lying down and letting the snow cover her like a blanket, but something stubborn and fierce inside her refused to give up so easily. Harper pushed herself back to her feet, her legs shaking, and pressed onward through the storm, tears freezing on her cheeks as she fought for each breath. The world had become nothing but white and cold and wind, and she could no longer tell which direction she was moving, whether she was walking deeper into the wilderness or back toward the safety of town. Her shoulder struck something solid and she cried out, stumbling sideways before realizing she had walked straight into the side of a building. Harper ran her frozen hands along the rough wooden planks, searching for a door or window, anything that might offer a way inside, but her fingers were too numb to feel properly, and the snow had piled so high against the structure that she could not tell what kind of building it was. She continued along the wall, half walking and half crawling, until her hand found the edge of a door frame, and she sobbed with relief as she threw herself against the door, praying it would open. It did not budge. Harper hammered on it with all the strength she had left, which was precious little, and her vision began to blur at the edges, darkness creeping in from all sides. She slumped against the door, her body giving up even as her mind screamed at her to keep fighting, and she felt herself sliding down toward the snow-covered ground, her legs unable to hold her weight any longer. The sound of splintering would cut through the roar of the wind, and suddenly strong hands grabbed her arms, pulling her upward and out of the storm's grip. Harper tried to speak, but her mouth would not form words, and she felt herself being lifted and carried, the sensation strange and distant as if it were happening to someone else. Warmth began to penetrate the icy shell that had formed around her, blessed warmth that hurt almost as much as the cold had, and she heard a deep voice speaking words she could not quite understand through the fog that had settled over her mind. Quinn Sutherland had been checking the doors and windows of his small ranch house when he heard the faint sound of someone pounding on wood, barely audible over the blizzard's howl. He lived alone on his property about a mile outside of Montrose, having inherited the land from his uncle 2 years ago and spent every day since then working to build it into a proper cattle ranch. though the harsh Colorado winters made that dream a slow and difficult one to achieve. At 26 years old, he had seen his share of blizzards, but this one was shaping up to be the worst he could remember, and he had spent the last hour making sure his 6 horses and dozen cattle were secured in the barn with enough hay and water to last several days if needed. When he heard the pounding, his first thought was that something had come loose in the storm, but then he heard it again, more desperate and irregular, and he realized with a jolt of alarm that someone was out there in the freezing hell that had descended upon the mountain valley. Quinn grabbed his heavy coat and pulled it on as he rushed to the front door, throwing it open and immediately being hit by a blast of snow and wind so powerful it nearly knocked him backward. He squinted into the whiteness, seeing nothing at first, and then he spotted the dark shape slumped against his door, a woman in a thin dress that was completely inadequate for the weather, her skin pale as death and her lips blue. He did not hesitate. Quinn scooped her up in his arms, shocked by how light she felt, and kicked the door shut behind him as he carried her deeper into the house, away from the draft. She was barely conscious, her eyes rolling back in her head, and he knew he had only minutes to warm her up before the cold finished what it had started. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he laid her down on the thick rug in front of his fireplace, where flames crackled and danced, throwing heat into the room. He pulled off her soaked boots and stockings, wincing at how cold her feet felt, and then wrapped her in every blanket he owned, rubbing her hands and arms through the fabric to encourage blood flow. Harper's eyes fluttered open and she stared up at him with confusion and fear, her body beginning to shake violently as it tried to generate warmth. Quinn met her gaze, his own dark brown eyes filled with concern, and he spoke in a low, steady voice that cut through her panic. "You are safe now. You are inside and warm. Just breathe slowly and let your body adjust." She tried to speak, but her teeth chattered too hard, and instead she just nodded, tears spilling down her face as the reality of how close she had come to dying settled over her. Quinn continued to rub warmth back into her limbs, his touch firm but gentle, and gradually the violent shaking began to subside into smaller tremors. He moved to the kitchen and returned with a cup of weak tea that was barely warm, knowing that giving her anything too hot too quickly could send her body into shock, and he helped her sit up enough to take small sips. "What were you doing out in that storm?" Quinn asked after she had finished half the cup, his voice rough with the hint of a Texas accent that he had never quite lost despite 10 years in Colorado. He had a strong, weathered face with high cheekbones, and a jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, his black hair falling past his collar in waves that needed cutting. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built like a man who spent his days doing hard physical labor, and there was something about the steady way he looked at her that made Harper feel both safe and strangely nervous. "I was locked out," she managed to say, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "I went to get firewood and the door blew shut behind me. I could not get back inside." The words came out halting and broken, and fresh tears tracked down her face as she remembered the terror of being trapped in the storm with nowhere to go. Quinn's expression darkened with anger, though she could tell it was not directed at her. "You could have died out there. This is the worst blizzard I have seen in years. Where do you live?" "The boarding house on Maple Street," Harper said, and she watched his face as he processed that information, saw the calculation in his eyes as he worked out the distance. "I did not know where I was walking. I just kept moving until I found your door." "You walked over a mile in that storm," Quinn said, and there was something like admiration mixed with the concern in his voice. "That took courage or stubbornness, maybe both." He adjusted the blankets around her shoulders, making sure she was completely covered. "You are lucky you found this place. There is nothing else between here and the mountains but open range." Harper closed her eyes, exhaustion crashing over her now that the immediate danger had passed. Her entire body ached, the kind of deep, bone-tired pain that came from pushing past every limit, and she could feel herself starting to drift despite her efforts to stay awake. Quinn seemed to notice because he gently took the cup from her trembling hands and set it aside, then helped her lie back down on the rug, making sure the blankets were tucked securely around her. "Sleep," he said quietly. "You are safe here. I will keep the fire going." She wanted to thank him, to ask his name, to say a dozen things. But sleep pulled her under before she could form the words, and she fell into darkness with the sound of the wind howling outside and the warmth of the fire on her face. Quinn sat in his chair and watched her sleep, making sure her breathing stayed steady and her color continued to improve. He added logs to the fire every hour, keeping the room warm but not too hot, and listened to the blizzard rage against the walls of his house. The wind screamed like a living thing, rattling the windows and piling snow against the doors, and he knew they would be trapped here together for at least a day or two, maybe longer depending on how much snow fell and how quickly it could be cleared. He studied the woman sleeping on his floor, trying to piece together who she was and what had brought her to Montrose. She had an Eastern accent, refined and educated, not the rough frontier speech he was used to hearing, and her dress, though simple and now ruined by the storm, had been well made and tailored to fit her properly. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with long auburn hair that fell in tangled waves around her shoulders and a face that was pretty in a delicate way, all fine bones and pale skin that spoke of a life spent mostly indoors. Her hands, which he had held while warming them, were small but marked with the tiny needle pricks and calluses of someone who did detailed handwork, possibly a seamstress or embroiderer. Quinn felt an unfamiliar twist in his chest as he looked at her, something he had not experienced in a long time, and he forced himself to look away and focus on the practical matters at hand. She would need dry clothes when she woke, food and hot drinks to help her body fully recover from the cold, and probably several days of rest before she would be strong enough to make the journey back to town, assuming the storm cleared by then. He rose from his chair and went to dig through the trunk at the foot of his bed, pulling out an old shirt and a pair of wool pants that would be far too large for her, but would at least be warm and dry. Dawn came gray and dim, the sun barely visible through the heavy clouds that continued to dump snow on the valley. Quinn had not slept, keeping vigil through the night to make sure Harper's condition did not worsen, and he felt the weariness in his bones as he stood and stretched, his back cracking. The fire had burned low and he built it back up, then went to check on the animals in the barn, fighting his way through snow that came up to his thighs in places. The horses nickered at him when he entered, and he spent an hour making sure they all had food and water, then checked on the cattle in the attached stall, relieved to find them all accounted for and reasonably comfortable despite the storm. When he returned to the house, stamping snow off his boots and shaking it from his coat, he found Harper awake and sitting up, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders but her eyes clear and alert. She watched him as he hung his coat by the door and pulled off his boots, and he could see the wariness in her expression, the natural caution of a woman alone with a strange man in an isolated place. "How are you feeling?" Quinn asked, keeping his distance and his voice neutral, wanting to put her at ease. "Better," Harper said, and her voice was stronger now, less hoarse. "Cold still, but better. Thank you for saving my life. I would have died out there if you had not heard me." Anyone would have done the same, Quinn said, though they both knew that was not necessarily true. He gestured to the bundle of clothes he had left on the chair. Those are for you if you want to change out of your wet dress. They will be too big, but they are dry and warm. There is a screen in the corner you can use for privacy. Harper looked at the clothes and then back at him, and he saw gratitude and embarrassment war in her expression. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not mean to impose on your hospitality. As soon as the storm clears, I will return to town and be out of your way." "The storm is not clearing any time soon," Quinn said, moving to the kitchen to give her space. "We are looking at another day of heavy snow, at least, maybe two. The roads will be impassable even after it stops. You are stuck here until it is safe to travel, so there is no sense worrying about imposing. I have enough food for both of us and plenty of firewood. We will manage." He heard the rustle of fabric as she stood and made her way behind the wooden screen he used for bathing, and he focused on preparing breakfast, putting a pot of coffee on to boil and slicing salt pork to fry in a skillet. The domesticity of the situation felt strange to him. He had lived alone for so long that having another person in his space, especially a woman, made him hyper-aware of every sound and movement. He heard her moving behind the screen, the soft sounds of fabric sliding over skin, and he forced himself to think about anything other than the fact that she was undressing only a few feet away from him. When Harper emerged, she looked almost comically small in his oversized clothes, the shirt hanging past her hips and the pants cinched tight at the waist with a length of rope she had found. She had rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, and her wet auburn hair hung loose down her back, slowly drying in the heat from the fire. Despite the ridiculous fit of the clothes, or maybe because of it, Quinn found himself thinking she looked beautiful, and he quickly turned back to the stove before she could catch him staring. "I hope you like salt pork and coffee," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "It is not fancy, but it will fill your belly." "It smells wonderful," Harper said, and he heard her move closer, settling into one of the chairs at his small wooden table. "I do not think I have ever been so hungry in my life." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of forks on plates and the continued howl of the wind outside. Quinn found himself sneaking glances at her between bites, noting the way she ate with careful, precise movements despite her obvious hunger, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands as if trying to absorb every bit of its warmth. Finally, he could not stand the silence any longer and cleared his throat. "I am Quinn Sutherland," he said. "I own this ranch, though calling it a ranch is being generous. Right now it is more of a homestead with delusions of grandeur." Harper smiled at that, and it transformed her whole face, making her eyes light up and bringing color to her cheeks. "Harper Garrison," she said. "I am a seamstress at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop in Montrose. I came west from Boston 3 months ago." "Boston is a long way from here," Quinn observed. "What brought you to Colorado?" The smile faded from her face and she looked down at her plate, pushing a piece of salt pork around with her fork. "My father died last spring," she said quietly. "He was a lawyer, but he had debts I did not know about. After the creditors took everything, I had nothing left. A friend told me there were opportunities out west for women willing to work hard, so I used the last of my money to buy a train ticket. I ended up in Montrose because it was as far as my money would take me." Quinn heard the pain beneath her words, the loss and displacement, and he felt a surge of respect for her courage. Boston to Montrose was not just a physical distance. It was a journey between two completely different worlds, and for a young woman alone to make that leap took a kind of bravery he could appreciate. "I am sorry about your father," he said. "That must have been difficult." "It was," Harper admitted. "But I am learning to build a new life here. Mrs. Patterson has been kind to me, and the work is steady. I had hopes of saving enough money to eventually open my own shop, though that seems like a distant dream most days." She looked up at him, her green eyes studying his face. "What about you? How did you end up here?" Quinn leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. "I grew up in Texas, on my family's ranch outside of San Antonio. My parents died when I was young and I was raised by my uncle, but we never quite saw eye to eye on how things should be run. When I was 21, I decided to strike out on my own. I worked various ranches through Texas and New Mexico, learning the trade and saving money. 4 years ago, my uncle died and left me this land. It was a shock. We had not parted on the best of terms, and I never expected to inherit anything from him. But here I was, suddenly a landowner in Colorado, and I figured I owed it to him to try to make something of the place." "Do you like it here?" Harper asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "I do," Quinn said after a moment of thought. "It is hard work and lonely sometimes, but it is mine. I answer to no one but myself. There is something satisfying about that." He paused, then added, "Though I will admit that having someone to talk to is nice. I go days sometimes without speaking to another person." They continued talking as they finished breakfast, the conversation flowing more easily as they relaxed around each other. Quinn learned that Harper was 22 years old, that she loved to read but had few books in the boarding house, that she missed the ocean from her childhood visits to Cape Cod but had grown to appreciate the stark beauty of the mountains. Harper learned that Quinn was a skilled horseman, that he played the guitar though not particularly well, that he had a dry sense of humor that sometimes caught her off guard and made her laugh unexpectedly. The day passed slowly as the storm continued to rage outside. Quinn taught Harper how to play poker with a worn deck of cards he kept in a drawer, and she proved to be a quick study, winning more hands than she lost and teasing him mercilessly when she caught him bluffing. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories from their pasts, their hopes for the future, the small details of their daily lives that seemed insignificant but painted pictures of who they were as people. As evening approached, Quinn prepared dinner while Harper sat by the fire and watched him work, offering to help but accepting when he insisted she should rest and continue recovering from her ordeal. He made a simple stew from dried beef and vegetables, the kind of meal he had cooked 1,000 times before, but somehow it felt different doing it while she watched, made him more conscious of his movements and whether he was doing things properly. "You are a good cook," Harper said as they ate, and he could tell she meant it. "I have had a lot of practice cooking for myself," Quinn replied. "You learn quick when the alternative is going hungry." That night, Quinn insisted Harper take his bed while he made himself comfortable on the floor by the fire with a pile of blankets. She protested at first, saying she had already imposed enough and could not possibly take his bed, but he was firm in his insistence, and eventually she gave in. He lay awake long after she had gone to sleep, listening to her quiet breathing from the other room and the endless howl of the wind, and he found himself thinking about how strange and unexpected life could be, how a blizzard could bring a woman literally to his doorstep and change the feeling of his home in the span of a single day. The second day of the storm was much like the first, except the snow began to taper off in the afternoon, the wind losing some of its fury though it continued to blow hard enough to create drifts taller than a man. Quinn ventured out to check on the animals again and to assess the damage, and when he returned, he reported to Harper that they were completely snowed in, with drifts blocking the doors and windows and making travel impossible until things melted or he could dig them out. "I am sorry," Harper said, genuine distress in her voice. You must be tired of having me here, using your food and taking up your space." Quinn shook his head firmly. "I am not tired of you at all," he said, and realized as he spoke that it was absolutely true. In fact, he had been dreading the moment when she would leave and he would be alone again, though he would never admit that out loud. "You are good company, Harper, better company than I have had in a long time. Do not apologize for something that is not your fault." She looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression, and he felt the air between them change, become charged with an awareness that had been building since she first opened her eyes and found him watching over her. He cleared his throat and turned away, suddenly nervous in a way he had not been since he was a boy, and busied himself with adding wood to the fire. They spent that afternoon in comfortable companionship, Quinn working on repairing a bridle that had cracked, while Harper examined her ruined dress and tried to salvage what she could of it. She had clever fingers and a good eye, and he found himself watching her work with quiet fascination, admiring the quick, precise movements of her hands and the focused expression on her face. When she caught him staring, she raised an eyebrow in question, and he felt heat rise to his face. "You are very skilled at that," Quinn said, gesturing to the dress. "I can barely sew a button back on." Harper smiled. "It is what I do for a living, though I fear this dress is beyond saving. The hem is completely destroyed and the fabric is water-stained throughout. I will have to make a new one when I get back to town." "I could pay for the fabric," Quinn offered impulsively, "since you lost this one because of the storm." "Absolutely not," Harper said firmly. "You saved my life. I am not going to accept money from you for a dress. Besides, I have some fabric set aside at the shop. Mrs. Patterson lets me buy materials at cost." They fell into an easy argument about it, both of them stubborn in their own ways, and finally agreed to disagree, though Quinn privately resolved to find some way to make it up to her once they got back to town. The conversation moved on to other topics, and as evening fell and they prepared dinner together this time, Quinn found himself thinking how natural it felt to have her there, how right it seemed to have another person moving through his space, sharing his meals, filling the rooms with laughter and conversation. That night, as Harper prepared for bed, she turned to Quinn with a serious expression. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," he said. "Why did you break down your door to save me? You did not know who I was or what I was doing there. I could have been anyone. You damaged your own property and risked going out in the storm yourself." Quinn considered the question, trying to find words for something he had not really thought about in the moment. "I heard someone in trouble," he finally said. "That was all that mattered. I could not live with myself if I had ignored it and found out later that someone died on my doorstep. As for the door, wood can be repaired. A person cannot come back from freezing to death." Harper's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she crossed the room quickly, standing on her toes to press a kiss to his cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being the kind of man who breaks down doors to save strangers." She disappeared into the bedroom before he could respond, and Quinn stood frozen in place, his hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. He felt something shift inside his chest, a wall he had built around his heart beginning to crack, and he realized with startling clarity that he was falling for this woman who had stumbled into his life in the middle of a blizzard. The third day dawned clear and bright, the storm finally having blown itself out during the night. Quinn woke early and began the massive task of digging out from the snow, shoveling paths to the barn, and clearing the drifts that had piled against the house. Harper insisted on helping despite his protests, and together they worked through the morning, their breath steaming in the cold air as they carved tunnels through snow that came up to their waists in places. "This is incredible," Harper said, pausing to look around at the transformed landscape. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of white, the world looking clean and new and impossibly beautiful under the bright blue sky. "I have never seen so much snow in my life." "It is beautiful until you have to move it all," Quinn said wryly. But he was smiling as he said it, enjoying the pleasure in her expression as she took in the winter wonderland around them. They stopped for lunch and then continued working, and by late afternoon they had cleared enough space to move around the property comfortably. Quinn checked on the animals again, relieved to find them all healthy and content, and then returned to the house to find Harper had started preparing dinner, moving around his kitchen with increasing familiarity and confidence. "I hope you do not mind," she said when she saw him. "I wanted to do something to help after everything you have done for me." "I do not mind at all," Quinn said, and he meant it. There was something deeply appealing about coming home to find someone waiting, about the smell of food cooking and the warmth of the fire, and the knowledge that he would not be eating alone. He washed up and joined her at the table, and they ate together as the sun set outside, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. As they were cleaning up after dinner, Harper broached the subject they had both been avoiding. "The road should be passable tomorrow, should it not?" "If the sun stays out and melts some of the snow." Quinn felt his stomach sink but nodded. "Probably. It will be slow going, but we should be able to make it back to town by afternoon if we leave early." "Oh," Harper said quietly, and he heard the same reluctance in her voice that he felt. "That is good. I am sure Mrs. Patterson is worried about me, and you probably have work that needs doing." "Harper," Quinn said, and she turned to look at him, her green eyes wide and questioning. He struggled to find the right words, feeling clumsy and uncertain. "These past few days, having you here, it has been the best time I have had since I moved to this ranch. I know we barely know each other, and I know the circumstances were not ideal, but I would like to see you again after you go back to town. If you would want that." Her face lit up with a smile that made his heart skip. "I would want that very much," she said softly. "I have felt it too, Quinn, this connection between us. It feels like more than just being thrown together by circumstance." He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hands in his, marveling at how small and delicate they felt. "Then we will make sure this is not goodbye," he said. "I will come visit you in town. We will find ways to spend time together. I am not letting you walk out of my life just because the storm ended." Harper squeezed his hands, her eyes shining. "I am not ready to leave," she admitted. "Is that foolish? I have only been here 3 days, but this place, being here with you, it feels more like home than anywhere I have been since my father died." Quinn felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest, and without thinking about it, he pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt both natural and terrifying in its intensity. Harper melted against him, her head fitting perfectly under his chin, and they stood like that for a long moment, neither wanting to be the first to let go. When they finally separated, both of them were flushed and breathing a little faster, and Quinn could see his own emotions reflected in Harper's face. There was attraction there, undeniable and growing stronger by the hour, but there was also something deeper, a recognition that went beyond the physical, as if their souls had been waiting for this moment to find each other. They spent that evening sitting close together on the rug in front of the fire, not quite touching but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from each other's bodies. They talked about their hopes and dreams, about the lives they wanted to build and the people they wanted to become, and Quinn found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, opening up in ways that would have terrified him if it had been with anyone other than Harper. "I want this ranch to be something special," he said, staring into the flames. "Not just a place where I survive, but somewhere I can build a real life. I want to expand the herd, build a proper house, maybe even hire a few hands to help with the work. I want to be someone my uncle would have been proud of." "He would be proud of you," Harper said with certainty. "You are a good man, Quinn. Hard-working and kind and brave. Anyone would be proud to call you family." Quinn turned to look at her, his heart pounding. "What about you? What do you want for your future?" Harper was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "I want to feel like I belong somewhere again," she said finally. "Boston stopped feeling like home after my father died, and Montrose is just a place I ended up, not somewhere I chose. I want to find a place where I fit, where I am not just surviving but actually living. I want to build something of my own, whether that is a shop or a home or just a life that feels meaningful. And I want to share it with someone who sees me, really sees me, not just as a woman or a seamstress but as a person." "I see you," Quinn said quietly, and she turned to meet his eyes, her expression open and vulnerable. "I see your strength and your courage and your kindness. I see how you keep going even when things are hard. I see how you laugh at my terrible jokes and how you cheat at cards when you think I am not looking." "I do not cheat," Harper protested, but she was smiling, and then Quinn was smiling too, and somehow they were closer than they had been before, their faces only inches apart. "Harper," Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion, "can I kiss you?" "Yes," she breathed. And then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper as she responded, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair while his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. The kiss was everything he had imagined and more, sweet and fierce and full of promise, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together. "I am falling in love with you," Quinn said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I know it is too soon and too fast, but it is the truth." "It is not too soon," Harper said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I am falling in love with you too. I think I started falling the moment I woke up and saw you watching over me, making sure I was safe." They kissed again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They lost themselves in each other, hands exploring and hearts pounding, and when they finally pulled apart, they were both flushed and dizzy with want. But Quinn was a gentleman, and Harper was not ready to take things further, so they simply held each other, content to be close, and to know that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. That night, Harper again slept in Quinn's bed while he took the floor, but before she went to sleep, she came out and kissed him good night, a long, lingering kiss that left him aching with longing. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the sound of her breathing from the other room and thinking about how completely his life had changed in the span of a few days. The next morning they packed up Harper's ruined dress and the few belongings she had with her, and Quinn saddled 2 horses, his reliable gelding Thunder and a gentle mare named Sage who would be suitable for Harper to ride. The journey back to Montrose took several hours, the horses having to pick their way carefully through the snow-packed trail. But the weather remained clear and cold, perfect for traveling. As they rode, Quinn and Harper talked about their plans, agreeing that he would come into town the following Sunday to take her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the closest thing Montrose had to a fancy establishment. They also agreed that they would write to each other, Harper promising to send him letters through the general store since Quinn made the trip to town for supplies once a week. When they finally rode into Montrose, the town was still digging out from the storm, shopkeepers shoveling snow from their walkways and residents working to clear the streets. Harper directed Quinn to the boarding house on Maple Street, and when they arrived she slid down from Sage's back with practiced ease, having proven herself a natural rider during the journey. Mrs. Thornton, the boarding house keeper, came rushing out when she saw them, her face a mixture of relief and reproach. "Harper Garrison, where on earth have you been? We thought you had frozen to death in the storm." "I was locked out," Harper explained, and quickly recounted a condensed version of her ordeal, how she had been caught in the blizzard and found shelter at Quinn's ranch. She left out many of the details, keeping the story focused on the basic facts, but Mrs. Thornton seemed satisfied with the explanation and turned her attention to Quinn. "You must be the young man who saved her life," Mrs. Thornton said, looking him up and down with the assessing gaze of a woman who had seen everything in her 60-some years. "Well, you have my thanks, Mr. Sutherland. We would have been devastated to lose Harper. She is one of our favorites here." Quinn tipped his hat politely. "Just did what anyone would do, madam. Glad I was there to help." Harper retrieved her small bundle of belongings from Thunder's saddlebag, and Quinn walked her to the door, keenly aware of Mrs. Thornton's watchful presence. "Sunday," he said quietly, so only Harper could hear. "I will be here at 11 o'clock." "I will be ready," Harper promised. And then on impulse she stood on her toes and kissed his cheek quickly before disappearing inside the boarding house, leaving Quinn standing on the walkway with a foolish smile on his face. The next few days were the longest of Quinn's life. He threw himself into work on the ranch, repairing storm damage and tending to the animals, but his mind was always on Harper, replaying their conversations and the feeling of her in his arms. He started 3 different letters to her and threw them all away, unable to capture in words what he felt. Finally, on Friday, he gave up on eloquence and simply wrote the truth: that he missed her, that he was counting the hours until Sunday, that she had changed his life in ways he was still trying to understand. He rode into town the next day to pick up supplies and drop off the letter at the general store, where Mr. Phillips, the proprietor, gave him a knowing look. "Got yourself a sweetheart, do you, Quinn? Folks have been talking about how you brought young Miss Garrison back to town after the storm." Quinn felt his face heat. "We are friends," he said, though even to his own ears it sounded like an understatement. "She needed help and I provided it." "Uh-huh," Mr. Phillips said with a grin that suggested he did not believe that for a second. "Well, you could do worse than Harper Garrison. She is a fine young woman, hard-working and smart. You treat her right, you hear?" "I intend to," Quinn said seriously, and Mr. Phillips nodded with approval. When Quinn left the general store, he ran into Sheriff Davies, a gruff man in his 50s who had been keeping the peace in Montrose for the better part of 20 years. "Sutherland," the sheriff greeted him. "Heard you had some excitement during the storm." "News travels fast," Quinn observed. "Small town," the sheriff said with a shrug. "People talk, but I wanted to shake your hand. You did a good thing taking care of that girl when she needed help. Not everyone would have opened their door to a stranger." They shook hands, and Quinn felt a warm sense of belonging that surprised him. He had always kept himself apart from the town, focusing on his ranch and his work. But now people were greeting him on the street, thanking him for helping Harper, treating him like he was part of the community instead of just a loner on the outskirts. It felt good, feeling connected, and he realized that Harper had given him more than just her company. She had given him a reason to be part of something larger than himself. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, and Quinn spent an hour getting ready, shaving carefully and putting on his best shirt and pants, the ones he usually reserved for rare trips to church. He saddled Thunder and rode into town, his heart beating faster the closer he got to Maple Street. Harper was waiting for him on the boarding house porch, dressed in a beautiful green dress that brought out the color of her eyes. She had done something elaborate with her hair, pinning it up in a way that showed off the elegant line of her neck, and Quinn felt his breath catch at the sight of her. "You look beautiful," he said as he helped her up onto Thunder, settling her in front of him so they could ride together. "You look very handsome yourself," Harper said, and he felt absurdly pleased by the compliment. They rode slowly through town to the Montrose Hotel, the finest building in the area. A 3-story structure with a restaurant on the ground floor that served actual tablecloth meals instead of the usual frontier fare. Quinn helped Harper down and they went inside, where the host showed them to a quiet table by the window. The meal was one of the best Quinn had ever eaten, though he suspected that had more to do with the company than the food. They talked and laughed throughout the courses, comfortable with each other in a way that usually took months or years to develop, and he found himself thinking that this was what he wanted for the rest of his life. Harper across the table from him, her eyes bright with happiness, her laughter filling the air. After dinner, they walked through the town, Quinn pointing out various buildings and Harper sharing stories about the people who lived and worked in them. They stopped at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop so Harper could introduce Quinn to her employer, a kind-faced woman in her 50s who looked delighted to meet the man who had saved her best seamstress. "Harper has not stopped talking about you," Mrs. Patterson said with a warm smile. "I have never seen her so happy." "You must be quite special, Mr. Sutherland." "I am just a rancher, madam," Quinn said, feeling embarrassed but pleased. "Nothing special about me." "Oh, I think you are very special indeed, Mrs. Patterson said, and the way she looked at Harper made it clear she approved of whatever was developing between them. As the afternoon wore on, Quinn and Harper found themselves walking along the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open fields covered in snow. They stopped under a large cottonwood tree, its bare branches reaching toward the sky, and Quinn took Harper's hands in his. "I know we have only known each other a week," he said, "but I cannot imagine my life without you anymore. You have become essential to me, Harper. I want to court you properly with your permission. I want to build something real between us." Harper's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I want that too. I want everything with you, Quinn." He kissed her then, not caring who might see them, pouring all his feelings into the gesture. When they broke apart, they were both grinning like fools, and Quinn felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening in its intensity. The weeks that followed established a pattern to their courtship. Quinn came to town every Sunday, and they would have dinner together, walk through Montrose, and spend hours talking about everything and nothing. On Wednesdays, Quinn would stop by the dress shop after picking up his supplies, and Harper would step outside for a few minutes to see him, their brief encounters leaving them both counting the days until Sunday came around again. Quinn also began writing to Harper regularly, his letters gradually becoming more confident and eloquent as he found his voice on the page. Harper wrote back faithfully, her letters full of details about her work and her life in town, but also full of her feelings for him, the words on the page making his heart race every time he read them. As winter slowly gave way to early spring, Quinn began making plans. He wanted to ask Harper to marry him, but he wanted to do it right, wanted to have something to offer her beyond a small ranch and a lot of hard work. He started construction on an addition to his house, working late into the evenings to frame out 2 additional rooms and a proper kitchen. He also purchased 4 more head of cattle and 2 additional horses, expanding his operation and his income. In April, Quinn invited Harper to visit the ranch for the day, sending her a formal written invitation that made her laugh when she read it. She borrowed a horse from the livery stable and rode out on a Saturday morning, and Quinn's heart swelled with pride as he showed her around the property, pointing out the improvements he had made and the plans he had for the future. "This is wonderful, Quinn," Harper said as they stood on the small rise behind the house, looking out over the valley where his cattle grazed. "You have built something remarkable here." "I want to build more," Quinn said, turning to face her. "I want to build a life here, Harper. A family. A future." He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I want to build it with you." He dropped to one knee right there on the hillside, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band with a small sapphire, the best ring he could afford from the jeweler in Junction City, the nearest large town. "Harper Garrison, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a cowboy who loves you more than he ever thought possible?" Harper was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she nodded vigorously. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Quinn, I will marry you. I love you so much." Quinn slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms and kissing her deeply. They held each other on that hillside for a long time, the spring sun warm on their faces and the future stretching out before them bright and full of promise. They were married 6 weeks later, in June of 1881, in a simple ceremony at the Montrose church with half the town in attendance. Harper wore a dress she had made herself, an elegant creation in cream-colored silk that made her look like something out of a fairy tale, and Quinn wore a new suit that Mrs. Patterson had insisted on purchasing for him as a wedding gift. Sheriff Davies stood as Quinn's best man, and Mrs. Patterson served as Harper's matron of honor, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in cheers and applause. The reception was held in the church hall, with food provided by seemingly everyone in town, and Quinn found himself shaking hands and accepting congratulations from people he barely knew, all of them delighted to celebrate the romance that had begun during the worst blizzard in recent memory. The story of how Quinn had saved Harper had taken on a life of its own, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until it had become a sort of local legend. As evening fell and the party began to wind down, Quinn and Harper slipped away, riding together back to the ranch that was now their home. Quinn had finished the addition, and the house now had a proper bedroom, a spacious kitchen, and a small parlor where Harper had already set up her sewing area. He had also built her a workshop in the barn, a clean, well-lit space where she could work on her sewing projects, having decided to take on private commissions in addition to her work for Mrs. Patterson. That night, as they lay together in their marriage bed, Harper rested her head on Quinn's chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked quietly. "If the storm had not happened, if you had not heard me at your door, if you had decided I was not worth the trouble," Quinn tightened his arms around her. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "And then I thank God that I was in the right place at the right time, that I had the sense to break down that door instead of ignoring it. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, Harper. You made my house into a home. You made my life into something worth living." "You saved me in more ways than one," Harper said, tilting her head up to kiss his jaw. "You gave me a reason to stop just surviving and start actually living. You gave me a family again, a place to belong. I love you so much, Quinn Sutherland." "I love you too," Quinn said, and sealed the promise with a kiss that led to other things, the two of them finally able to express their love fully, without restraint or reservation. The first year of their marriage was one of hard work and deep happiness. Quinn continued to expand the ranch, and Harper proved herself invaluable, not just in maintaining the home but in helping with the actual ranch work when needed. She learned to ride like she had been born to it, and she was not afraid to get her hands dirty helping with the cattle or mucking out stalls. She also continued her sewing work. her reputation for quality craftsmanship spreading throughout the region, bringing in additional income that they used to further improve the property. In the spring of 1882, Harper told Quinn she was expecting their first child, and he responded by picking her up and spinning her around despite her laughing protests that he needed to be careful. They spent the months of her pregnancy preparing for the baby, Quinn building a cradle from oak wood and Harper sewing tiny clothes and blankets. When their son was born in November, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes, they named him Thomas, after Harper's father. Being parents changed them both in ways they had not anticipated. Quinn discovered depths of love and protectiveness he had not known existed, and watching Harper with their son, seeing the gentle way she cared for him and the fierce devotion in her eyes, made him fall in love with her all over again. Harper found a new sense of purpose in motherhood, though she was careful to maintain her own identity and her work, refusing to be defined solely by her role as a mother and wife. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. By their third anniversary, Quinn had 30 head of cattle, a dozen horses, and had hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men from town who were reliable and hard-working. He also began buying and selling horses, developing a reputation for training quality mounts, which brought in additional income and respect from other ranchers in the region. In the summer of 1884, Harper gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes, and from the moment she was born, she had both her parents wrapped around her tiny finger. Thomas, now nearly 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, his earnest attempts at assistance both helpful and chaotic in equal measure. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch thrived, the children grew healthy and happy, and Quinn and Harper's love for each other deepened with each passing year. They had their challenges, of course. Difficult winters, cattle diseases, lean financial times when money was tight, and they had to make hard choices about what to prioritize. But they faced everything together, their partnership strong and their commitment to each other unwavering. On the 5th anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, Quinn surprised Harper by declaring it their own personal holiday. He arranged for Mrs. Patterson to watch the children overnight, and he took Harper back to the spot on the hillside where he had proposed, bringing a picnic dinner and a bottle of wine he had been saving for a special occasion. As they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Harper leaned against Quinn's shoulder and sighed with contentment. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked, "before you had a wife and children to worry about?" Quinn considered the question seriously before answering. "Not even for a second," he said. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you came into my life. I thought I was content, but I was just going through the motions, existing but not really living. You and the children, this life we have built together, this is everything I ever wanted even when I did not know I wanted it." "I feel the same way," Harper said softly. "Sometimes I think about that night in the blizzard, how terrified I was, how certain I was that I was going to die. And then you broke down your door and saved me, and my whole life changed. You gave me everything, Quinn. A home, a family, a purpose, a love I never dreamed I would find. I am so grateful the storm brought me to your door. I am grateful you were stubborn enough to keep walking through that blizzard," Quinn said with a smile. "A lesser woman would have given up." They stayed on that hillside until full dark, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, talking about their memories and their hopes for the future. When they finally returned home, They made love with the passion and tenderness of two people who knew exactly how lucky they were to have found each other. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. In 1887, Harper's mother, who she had not seen since leaving Boston, wrote to say that she wanted to reconcile and meet her grandchildren. Harper and Quinn made the long journey east with Thomas and Rose, and though the visit was awkward at times, it allowed Harper to make peace with her past and establish a cordial relationship with her mother. They returned to Colorado, knowing that their life in the West was where they truly belonged. In 1889, they welcomed a third child, another boy they named William. His birth was difficult, and Harper was sick for weeks afterward, but she recovered fully with Quinn's devoted care. Thomas and Rose doted on their baby brother, and William grew into a cheerful, energetic child who kept the entire family on their toes. Quinn's ranch had become one of the most successful in the region, known for quality cattle and horses, and for the fair way Quinn treated his employees. He had 6 ranch hands now, and he had built a bunkhouse for them to live in, creating a small community on his property. Harper continued her sewing work, though she now focused more on teaching other women the trade, holding classes in town twice a month that were always well attended. They faced tragedy in 1891, when a fire swept through part of the barn, killing 3 horses and destroying a season's worth of stored hay. It was a devastating loss, both emotionally and financially, but Quinn and Harper rebuilt, and their neighbors rallied around them with donations of hay and offers of help that reminded them how deeply they were embedded in their community. In 1893, Thomas turned 11 and began helping seriously with the ranch work, showing a natural talent for handling animals and a maturity beyond his years. Quinn was immensely proud of his son, and he spent hours teaching him everything he knew about ranching and horses and the land. Rose, at 9, showed no interest in ranch work, but had inherited her mother's skill with a needle, and she spent hours in the workshop creating intricate embroidery and learning the art of dressmaking. William, at 4, was still too young for serious work, but followed his father and brother everywhere, asking endless questions and getting into harmless mischief. As the 19th century drew to a close, Quinn and Harper found themselves entering middle age with a sense of accomplishment and deep satisfaction. They had built something lasting, something meaningful, and they had done it together. The ranch was prosperous. Their children were healthy and happy, and their love for each other remained as strong as it had been that first week when they had been trapped together by the blizzard. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1901, Quinn organized a large party at the ranch, inviting everyone who had been part of their journey. Mrs. Patterson, who had retired but remained close to Harper, Sheriff Davies, who had become a good friend over the years, the ranch hands and their families, neighbors from miles around, and what seemed like half of Montrose. It was a beautiful summer evening, and they had set up tables in the yard, with food and music and dancing that lasted until well after dark. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Quinn and Harper stood together on the porch they had built together, watching their children laughing with friends. Thomas was 19 now, a strong young man who was already talking about finding land of his own to start his own ranch. Rose, at 17, was beautiful and talented, with several young men from town competing for her attention. William, at 12, was all energy and enthusiasm, never still for more than a few seconds. "We did well," Harper said, slipping her hand into Quinn's. "Look at what we built." "We did very well," Quinn agreed, squeezing her hand. "And we are not done yet. We have years ahead of us, you and I." "Years of what?" Harper asked with a smile. "Years of this," Quinn said, pulling her close. Years of waking up next to you, of working together, of watching our children become the people they are meant to be. Years of loving you more with each day that passes. That blizzard was the best thing that ever happened to me because it brought you into my life." "It was the best thing that ever happened to me too," Harper said, resting her head on his chest. "You saved me, Quinn, in every way a person can be saved." They stood like that as the last guests departed and their children finally went to bed. Two people who had been brought together by chance and circumstance and had chosen, every day since, to build a life together. The ranch stretched out around them in the darkness, everything they had worked for and dreamed of made real, and the future still held endless possibilities. In the years that followed, they would watch Thomas marry and start his own ranch, using skills his father had taught him. They would walk Rose down the aisle when she married a kind young man from Junction City, who shared her love of art and beauty. They would see William go off to university, the first member of either of their families to pursue higher education, and return to practice law in Montrose, using his education to help the community that had raised him. They would welcome grandchildren, 7 in total, and spoil them appropriately while teaching them the values of hard work and kindness and perseverance that had guided their own lives. They would celebrate 50 years of marriage in 1931, surrounded by 3 generations of family they had created together. And when Quinn gave a toast, he would talk about a blizzard in 1881 and a desperate woman who had pounded on his door, and how that moment had been the beginning of everything good in his life. Harper would cry, as she always did when Quinn talked about that night, and she would stand and kiss him in front of everyone, not caring that they were old now, that their hair was white and their movements slow. Because the love between them was as strong as it had ever been, forged in a storm and tempered by decades of shared life, and nothing could diminish it. And when they passed, within months of each other in 1935, the way longtime married couples often do, their children and grandchildren would remember them as a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, and that courage and kindness and the willingness to break down doors to save a stranger can change not just one life but generations to come. The ranch Quinn had built continued under Thomas's careful stewardship, and then under his sons and then his grandsons, each generation adding to it and improving it while maintaining the core values Quinn and Harper had established. The story of the blizzard became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder of where they had come from and the love that had started it all. And in Montrose, Colorado, where so much of their story had unfolded, people still talked about Quinn and Harper Sutherland decades after they were gone, about the cowboy who had saved a woman during the worst blizzard anyone could remember, and how that act of courage and compassion had blossomed into one of the great love stories of the American West. Their graves sat side by side on the hillside where Quinn had proposed, overlooking the valley they had loved, a testament to a love that had begun in desperation and grown into something beautiful and lasting. And on the headstone, beneath their names and dates, was a simple inscription that Harper had requested. He broke down the door and saved her life. She opened his heart and gave him a reason to live. Together they built forever. It was a fitting epitaph for a love that had started with a blizzard and lasted a lifetime, proving that sometimes the most extraordinary things begin with the simplest act of human kindness, and that the best stories are the ones where two people who were meant to find each other do so against all odds, and then have the courage and commitment to build something beautiful together, one day at a time, for all the days they are given.